Okay, well, hello, my name is John Puzey. I'm the former Director of Shelter Cymru, and I'm delighted the Back the Bill campaign has asked me to host this conversation with the Future Generations Commissioner, Sophie Howe, and a lot more about Sophie in a moment. The Back the Bill campaign is seeking to incorporate the right to adequate housing into Welsh law. And if you want to find out more about the campaign, and if you want to support the campaign, then you can go to the websites of either Type Howe or Shelter Cymru or the Chartered Institute of Housing in Cymru, where you'll find out a lot more. If you don't already know, it will become clear very soon why this conversation with Sophie is so very relevant to the Back the Bill campaign. But first, I want to properly introduce the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, Sophie Howe. Sophie's remit set out in law is the guardian of the interests of future generations in Wales. And indeed, Sophie is the world's only Future Generations Commissioner, and in fact has been described as the world's first Minister of the Unborn, which I think is a wonderful title, Sophie. Sophie took up the post in 2016 and has led high-profile interventions on transport, on planning, education, reform, climate change, challenging the government and others to demonstrate how they're taking account of future generations. She's been described as one of the UK's leading change makers, and her interventions have certainly created change, secured fundamental changes to land use policy, major transport schemes, and government housing policy on housing, so particularly relevant today. So a very warm welcome, Sophie. Thank you very much for finding the time to have this conversation with us.
Thank you for having me.
No, a pleasure. I just wonder whether it might be, just to start us off here, whether you might want to talk a little bit about, those kind of influences that have shaped you, have shaped your principles and your values, and how you've got to the vision of Wales that you have.
Well, I grew up in Ely, in Cardiff. Those of you who might know Ely, I often say it was sort of often in the headlines for the wrong reasons. So high levels of deprivation. This was in the 1980s, so really sort of challenging times. High levels of deprivation, high levels of unemployment, high levels of domestic abuse, teenage pregnancy, and so on. And I lived just, I could almost touch the local comprehensive, Glan Ely High as it was then, Michaelston College as it is now. But I didn't end up going to that school by virtue of the fact that both my parents worked, which was unusual, I suppose, for our community. And I ended up going to school in the leafy suburbs in the north of Cardiff, because that's where my grandparents lived. And I often think of it as a bit of a kind of sliding door moment, because the school at the end of my street, at the point that I would have gone to that school, was deemed as a failing school. It failed for a second time 10 years or so later, and then it was its name was changed and so on. But I think the kind of the kids that I went to school with in the leafy suburbs, they were kids whose families had been to university, and they were kids who lived in much better situations, not in poverty. There was that sense of aspiration and so on, and that was really quite different to the kids that I play with on the street at home. And that stayed with me throughout my life. Why is it that just by virtue of where you're born, or in my case where for the reasons of the fact that my parents were working and my grandparents had to pick me up from school, that that my life was potentially sort of different. And that it sticks with me, and I think it's fundamentally unjust. So I suppose I've got this sort of deep sense of irritation and annoyance and frustration that is the case. The other thing that changed, well, my dad in particular was quite involved in local politics, so I can remember marching through the streets of Cardiff with him on a right to work march in the early 80s when I was about 3 or 4. But I suppose the sort of second really sort of moment in my life which really sort of changed my thinking is I became the first in my family to go to university, but I fell pregnant in university, not planned. Nobody plans these things, I guess, and that gave me a sort of a different perspective as a mum who was trying to juggle, you know, studying and various other things, and being a young mum and not really having a clue about what I was doing, and you know, really struggling financially and so on, but also having a determination, because everyone told me that there you are, you've ruined your life, and you know, you're just another one of the statistics now from, you know, the place that you've come from, and I was determined, I suppose, to prove people wrong, but in a way that, you know, every girl coming from Ely should, you know, have that opportunity to do that.
That's great. Thanks, Sophie. So the whole range of your personal experiences have built that up. I think it's a really good idea actually to take the children on marches and demonstrations as early as you can. I think that really does help their understanding of the world.
I carried on the tradition. Sometimes it feels like a form of, I've dragged my kids around to meetings and campaigns and various things. Sometimes it feels like a form of child cruelty, but actually I think in the long run it's really good for them.
Essential education. You've published as a Future Generations Commissioner a really challenging, really I think quite exciting manifesto, which people can see on the Future Generations website, covering an extraordinary wide range of issues, which I think just shows you the remit that you have. And it begins with quite a challenging statement, I think. I'd just like to read it out. It starts by saying, our younger generations are calling out the failures of past decisions, and sadly often decisions in the continuing present that fail to take into account their futures. Embarrassing perhaps, but necessary. I think that's really quite a challenge to us all, isn't it? And I think those of us in housing and homelessness will probably all, you know, recognize that very strongly, that, you know, past decisions, underinvestment, going back many years, has led to many of the issues around housing and homelessness that we have today. And I think what's exciting for us in the housing lobby is that you have stated in the manifesto that housing should be a fundamental human right in Wales. I mean, why is that in your manifesto? Why do you feel that's so important?
Because I think housing has so many connections across all aspects of well-being, and you know, you talked about the kind of, you know, the breadth of the different types of recommendations and the different policy areas that I've covered, and I always say that's both the beauty and the challenge of the Future Generations Act, because I think the thing that we're never good at recognising is kind of everything's connected to everything. So, you know, if we want a healthy population, we have to have a population who has access to, you know, has a right to adequate housing. If we want a prosperous economy, we have to have healthy, educated, skilled people in the workforce. And so that connects back to housing because that affects our health. If we want to have, you know, vibrant communities and cohesive communities, then a right to housing and ensuring that everyone is able to exercise that right and that kind of level playing field for people, that is critically important to community cohesion. And, you know, if you take that further, community cohesion and vibrant communities are also the things that attract business and bring jobs. So it's all kind of connected. And so what we've tried to do in the in my Future Generations report, which contains over 200 recommendations, both on policy areas and sort of process, I suppose, the mechanics of governance. But there's from that, there's a manifesto for the future, 48 key recommendations, which in partnership with others, such as Sophie Howe, CHC, and many others from the housing sector, we have, or I've, you know, sort of considered are the things that if we did these things, it would make the biggest progress against all aspects of our national wellbeing goals.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wonder how you would respond to some of the people who, in a sense, oppose the idea of the incorporation of a right to home. I mean, not so much oppose it, but say, no, it's not the right time, or we haven't got the resources or the supply. You know, the narrative sometimes we hear is, well, it's no good introducing a right to a home until we've got enough homes for everyone to live in. I mean, what's your response to that, and how do we challenge those ideas, do you think?
I think I really like that saying, if not now, then when, and if not you, then who.
Yeah.
And, the fact that we've just found somewhere down the back of the sofa 400 billion quid to deal with the pandemic, should make us all stop and think that actually we can find the resources and the will and the effort and the focus if we want to achieve something. The problem is that we only ever want to achieve something when we're on a massively burning platform. A pandemic right here, right now, shutting down the economy. Even things like climate change, which are, literally a massively burning platform, is still slightly too distant for people to be able to sort of do the things that they need to do to take that seriously. So I think that we need to stop looking at things in the short term. And the things that really frustrate me is that, throughout your career, John, you will have seen probably the child who, came into shelter for advice with mum or dad, who'd been made homeless, who is now in a similar position or has got, mental health problems, or is in the criminal justice system, substance misuse issues, a frequent demand on our healthcare services. So even if you don't believe in the moral argument, which I do, even if you don't believe in the moral argument and the ethical argument, you should believe in the economics of this, because investing to prevent problems from occurring, absolutely is essential, particularly when we're seeing some of the big sort of changes in demography in our society. So things like, double the number of over 65s by 2036. If those over 65s are, people who throughout their lives have not had good quality housing, have not had the right sort of healthy behaviours and so on, those people are going to be a huge demand on infrastructure like our NHS. So if we think that we've got problems now during a pandemic, those demographic changes, paired with the fact that we're not doing enough to prevent people from becoming ill, and look at those wider issues that are the things that prevent people coming in ill, that's where, as Future Generations Commissioner, I can almost see that our future generations won't be able to access an NHS in any way, shape or form like we're able to now, simply because it will be swamped with demand of where we've just let problems stack up and stack up and stack up.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And it is an odd idea, isn't it? The idea that you recognize the importance of a right, but you say, well, we won't introduce it until we can meet that right, not recognizing that by introducing the right, that is one of the ways you drive towards achieving what you're trying to get. It's a strange idea, isn't it? But there we are.
I think you're so right on that. And I think, it's the same principles with the Future Generations Act. Do we think that by legislating suddenly, to say you've all got to think, long-term and preventative and integrated and so on, that suddenly overnight, every person taking decisions in the public sector is going to change the way that they do things? No, of course, that's unrealistic. But what it does do is it sets a framework for the sort of values that we have, the sort of Wales that we want to achieve, and it does move things in that direction. So I think that you've got to be, I'm often criticised for being too lofty perhaps in the aspirations that I have for Wales, but I make no apology for that whatsoever. I think we've got to be lofty in our aspirations. We've got to have something which we're working towards. And yes, there'll be bumps in the road, and I hate that actually. That's been a phrase that's been used in COVID, hasn't it? There's been challenges to get there, but I think we've got to set our aspirations and ambitions high.
Absolutely. I mean, inevitably, we're talking now about COVID and the lockdown and the awfulness of the last year. But I guess one of the things that's been very clear over the last year is that, I mean, obviously one of the clear narratives of the last year has been about the NHS and health and the virus itself, but the other one has been the home, isn't it? About stay at home, isolate at home, work at home, teach at home, and yet it's clear that, I mean, putting aside those people who haven't got a home, even those people who have got some sort of home, it's quite clear that many people are living in very inadequate housing. I mean, former organisation Shelter Cymru did some research on that and found lots of people in Wales living in overcrowded conditions or not having access to adequate space. So clearly, the whole issue of homes, in a sense, has come to the fore, I think, during this past year, more so perhaps than ever. And I'm just wondering what you feel, how we can ensure that housing is at the centre of the post-COVID recovery in Wales. How can we make sure that it's right up the political and resource agenda?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think, you're absolutely right. And, housing and the challenges of inadequate housing during the pandemic is just another issue of inequality, which this pandemic has exposed. And I think perhaps exposed in a way that has never really been appreciated before, because, if you're trying to homeschool your 4 children, in your lounge diner, and that's it. And, I had a particular sort of beef with my kids' school sending out an email saying homeschooling, Zoom calls should not take place in bedrooms or so on and so on, which I can sort of understand why they're saying that, but that to me is a complete disregard of any sort of reality for very many people who are trying to sort of juggle that. And okay, the kids have gone back to school, well, nearly all of them, but are we all going to go back to the office? No, I doubt it very much. In fact, in many ways, it's good that we don't all go back to the office. What does that mean in terms of people, the homes of people who will need to or may want to continue working from home? What does it mean in terms of our either ignorance or acceptance of the fact that those living on the lowest incomes or the most deprived communities are the ones that have least access to public open space, are the ones who are most likely to be living in areas of high air pollution? So what does that say to us about not just the house, the home as a unit, but the community and the place that home is within? And again, that's another area that's been really exposed during the pandemic, when we've all had to stay local. So I think that the key word in this Back the Bill campaign is the right to adequate housing. And I think, again, we've got to be ambitious in what we term adequate housing. So it is about space standards. It is about energy efficiency and making sure that homes are, zero carbon, ideally, or carbon neutral. It is about the wider community and how that's developed. It is about the sense of place and community. So I think that, my aspiration would be to have a much wider definition of adequate housing. And of course, all of that is underpinned by that, that adequate housing also being affordable.
Yeah, absolutely. You said right at the top of this that I absolutely agree with you that all these things are interrelated, and sometimes people kind of don't see that. Things kind of operate quite a lot in silos, don't they? And housing clearly is one of the key indicators and drivers of poverty. And I'm really interested in the manifesto that you published, that you've included the idea of piloting a basic income model. Could you say more about that? That's kind of a fascinating idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I'm really keen that Wales should explore as a pilot. And last night I did an Instagram live with a group of young people called I Have a Voice. And the question they put to me, well, hang on a minute, why would we give a basic income to everyone? Shouldn't we be targeting it at those who are most in need? And I think that that's a really valid question. So let me just explain why I think it should be something that we should be considering. So again, the pandemic has exposed the kind of precarious nature of work. So over the last number of years, there's been huge increases in the number of people who are working on 0-hour contracts, the number of people who are working in the gig economy. So these are perhaps your Uber Eats driver by night and graphic designer by day. These sorts of contracts who don't have that sort of security of work, who could be be earning 50 quid one week and 500 quid the next. And our welfare system can't cope with that. It can't cope with that kind of changing nature of work and income level. And all of the future trends suggest that those trends are only going to increase. And so I think that there's something about a universal basic income providing that safety net for those sorts of scenarios when we think about those future trends. I've commissioned some work with an organisation called Autonomy, who have expertise in this field, and we're looking at a number of models in terms of what could a universal basic income achieve in relation to the 7 national wellbeing goals set out in the Future Generations Act. So the biggest area, of course, is a huge reduction in poverty. Now, obviously, it depends on what level of basic income that would be paid, but the early estimations, and we're yet to publish our report, but our early estimations are set at a certain level, we could wipe out 50% of poverty, and set at a higher level, a very ambitious level, we could completely eradicate poverty through a universal basic income. The other areas, I suppose, are things like what does it do for your well-being? So when we talked about that connection to housing and health, there's a brilliant World Health Organization graph which explores the things that make the difference to life expectancy. So why is it that some people live longer than others, and so on? And what they've identified is 35% of what makes a difference is income security. So, whether you have that income security, whether you're living in poverty, and so on. 29% of what makes a difference is living conditions. So exactly what we're talking about here, the quality of, your quality of your housing, whether you have a house at all, whether you're living in areas of high air pollution, and your sort of, your general living environment. So if we could envisage a situation whereby, we had an adequate right to housing, or a right to adequate housing, and a universal basic income, that would make a substantial difference to people's health. What are the other things that it could do? Could it give you that kind of safety net so that you might think, actually, I could give a go to setting up this small business that I've been thinking about, or actually, I could reduce my working hours, or perhaps in the future, I must reduce my working hours because a robot's doing part of my job, but I could reduce my working hours so that I can provide care for the aging population that is coming our way, or be a bigger part of my community in terms of volunteering, or all of those sorts of things. So the knock-on consequence that you can see from giving people that income stability, I think could be really, really significant. It's important to say that what we're looking at in terms of a model of UBI would retain existing benefits. UBI would be on top of that. It would probably change pensions and child benefit, but and it would certainly be taxed, which is where the higher income earners would obviously be taxed on the UBI that they had. But other than that, it would retain all the other existing benefits, which is why it would take that number of people out of poverty.
Yeah, and certainly some of the models I've looked at, Sophie, I mean, the well-being aspects are really come across very strongly. I mean, I've seen models, as you say, where people have devoted more time to their community, have devoted more time to creative things that they would never have thought of doing. So that kind of, that rounded person kind of approach is something I think I've really noticed in the models that I've looked at. Yeah, so a really interesting proposal. We've been talking about health and housing. I just wonder if we could come back to that. I mean, Dickens was writing about the links between health and housing, in the mid sort of 19th century, wasn't he? And yet, even now, it seems to many of us, certainly working in the housing field, that we're still not working terribly well together to produce the best outcomes for people. I just wonder how you see that, and how we might address that problem, that unnecessary silo, if you like, between housing and health.
Mm-hmm. I agree. We've still not cracked this. I think, there's there's signs of to be optimistic about in terms of some of the monitoring work that I've done, looking at how things like public services boards are working together, and different public sector organisations. So we now have officers in Natural Resources Wales talking about childhood adversities. That would never have been the case a few years ago. We've got things like arts and health and big programmes around that. Just yesterday I was with Eluned Morgan, Minister for Mental Health, talking about social prescribing and how we can think about that in a non-medical way, and look at these wider determinants. So I think that there's some promising progress, but we've definitely not nailed it. And I think in terms of housing and health, there's still quite a big divide, I suppose. Maybe divide's the wrong word, but I'm not sure that there's the coming together of the different sort of sectors in terms of the understanding of the importance of housing to health, and vice versa. So there's definitely more to be done there. And this is why I'm calling for an approach to a national wellness system, because back to that World Health Organization graph that I was talking about, if you pick the areas in terms of, that they've identified that make the difference, income security, living conditions, actually what I find really interesting is 19% of what makes a difference is sort of community cohesion, relationships. Do you have a sense of agency in your community? If we pick those areas and address those areas, and even look, and I've suggested this in the manifesto, that we top slice budgets, all Welsh Government budgets, starting at 10%, and allocate that top slice into those sort of preventative actions or those wider determinants, I would see there that you would see some substantial shift into funding things like better quality and higher numbers of housing in Wales.
Sure. Interesting stuff. You set out a vision for Wales. I'm just wondering if you've got a particular view of how you see the housing landscape. Looking ahead, I don't know, 2030, 2050. Not that I'll be here, but I mean, I wonder how you see that in terms of contributing to the kind of vision you have for Wales.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the housing sector is really key in this, and my Future Generations report is pretty complimentary of the sector as a whole. And I think that the sector has the values of public service, but perhaps in many cases a more its nimbleness, is that even a word? But we'll go with it. Its nimbleness is more akin to some of the better innovation, I suppose, in the private sector. And so I think that the housing sector has got to be a kind of key part of building not just houses, but building communities and building the Wales that we want to see. So if we think again about the kind of the things that are in that manifesto, so the creation of green jobs and the skills that are needed to do that. If we could think about housing, the retrofit of energy efficiency measures in home, sustainable methods of construction. If we could think about things around land management and sites for nature and so on in communities, the housing sector have huge opportunities there to be, or if we invest in the housing sector, there's huge opportunities to create those sorts of jobs and skills. If we look at again back to those stats on health, if we look at the importance of cohesive communities, the housing sector, I think in many cases are often the only kind of public service that still exists in many communities. Because of austerity, things have been stripped away. And we know also that often housing associations, housing managers and housing officers and so on are the people who have the sort of closest direct relationships with families. So things like that kind of those issues around wider well-being, issues around things like domestic abuse. I think the housing sector is so critically well placed to have opportunities to drive change at a strategic level and make those connections, but to also bring that back to what is going on for our tenants. You know, what opportunities are for us as this sector to better support our tenants, not just in terms of meeting their housing need, but in this sort of wider sense.
I think that's great, and I think that's probably a very good place to close our conversation, Sophie, which I really enjoyed. Thank you very much. And again, thank you for finding the time to talk to us. Just a reminder to everybody that the Future Generations Manifesto, which I said is a really challenging and exciting manifesto. You need to read it. You should go to the Future Generations website where you'll find that. And again, a reminder in terms of back the bill, the aim to incorporate the right to adequate housing into Welsh law. More information about that and how you can support it on the websites of Sophie Howe or Shelter Cymru or Chartered Institute of Housing Cymru, or all three if you like, and just see if they say all the same thing. I think they do. So once again, Sophie, thank you very much for that, and best of luck with the manifesto.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.